Few things are more frustrating than falling for a cheap trick in the opening, but after today, you'll be able to catch, punish, and shut down those traps. You start winning fast, defending like a master, and making your opponent regret ever trying. So yeah, no messing around. I'm Philip, let's jump right in. So this trap shows up in the Italian game with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. Everything is standard so far. But then black goes knight to d4, and suddenly the position gets interesting. What's black actually going for here? Because knight to d4 just leaves the e5 pawn hanging. So now you gotta ask, can white just take that pawn for free? Or is there some kind of trap hiding behind this knight to d4? So let's see what happens if white takes the bait. Knight takes e5 looks strong. You grab the pawn and you're kind of threatening knight takes f7 or maybe bishop takes f7. But here's the thing. After knight takes e5, black goes queen to g5, and now white is already stepping into the trap. And here's the idea. When white goes knight takes f7, trying to hit the queen on g5 and the rook on h8, black stays calm and lines up the counter. Black takes on g2 with the queen. That move goes after the rook on h1, and then the whole position is hanging and white is in real trouble. So if white goes rook f1 to defend, then black goes queen takes e4 with check. White's got to play bishop to e2 because otherwise the queen is hanging. After bishop to e2, knight to f3 is checkmate. Simple as that. And here's the thing. That whole idea comes from knight to d4. Now the real question is knight to d4 actually a good move, or is it just there to pull the trick? So before you copy it in your own games, take a second and think about the position, because sometimes the tactic works and sometimes that knight is just hanging. The truth is, knight to d4 just isn't a good move in this position, because after knight takes d4, pawn takes d4, white ends up with a better pawn structure and is more developed too. Plus, you're moving the same piece twice, which goes against one of the basic opening principles, because you're just wasting development time. So, what's the only real reason to play knight to d4 then? It's just to set up the trick, and black's basically waiting for white to mess up and take the pawn on e5 so they can drop queen to g5 and take the win. And here's something important you should know. You really got to be careful playing these kinds of positions, these traps that only work if your opponent makes a mistake. So let me ask you, is it actually worth trying to play openings with traps? The real answer is it's only worth it if there's some deeper idea behind it, something more than just going for a trick. And with knight to b4, the only plan is to set the trap. It's basically just a bluff where you're waiting and hoping your opponent blunders. But honestly, you should always be looking for the best move no matter what your opponent plays. So, alright, let's check out the next opening trap. Now we're going to move on to a common trap in queen's pawn openings. The sequence starts with d4, d5, c4, and that's the famous queen's gambit. This is where black plays pawn to e5, going into the Alban counter gambit. White takes with pawn takes e5, and then black goes pawn to d4, which is the signature move of this line. So what's the whole idea behind the Alban counter gambit? After d4, black's going to sack a pawn right away. In return, they disrupt white's entire queenside development in a really concrete way. You'll notice the knight can't get to its natural square on c3 anymore. Meanwhile, black can start putting some real pressure on that e5 pawn with knight to c6. Their development gets way smoother, they gain more space, and they can develop their pieces way more freely. Now pay close attention here, because against the Alban gambit, there's a move that looks totally natural, almost obvious, and that's pawn to e3. The idea is to exchange the pawn on d4 and free up some space to develop your pieces, which makes sense, right? That move's already a mistake. After e3, black drops bishop to b4 check, forcing white to block with bishop to d2. And now comes the hidden shot. Black goes pawn takes e3, sacrificing the bishop on b4, which might look like a crazy idea, but it's not, because the idea behind this sack is absolutely crushing. After bishop takes b4, black goes pawn takes f2 check, and now white's in serious trouble. So let's take a look at both possibilities. If white plays king takes f2, they just drop the queen on d1 just like that. But if white goes king to e2, trying to keep the queen defended, then black's got a critical follow-up you really need to know. Pawn takes g1, under promoting to a knight check. Notice how this move's critical. If you go bishop to g4 right away, white still has knight to f3 as a defensive resource. That's why you got to start with the knight to force the check first. And then, after rook takes g1, you drop bishop to g4, and the queen's just lost. But what if white goes king to e1? Then the line goes queen to h4 check, forcing king to d2, and after knight to c6 attacking the bishop, and bishop to c3, you drop bishop to g4. You end up in a position where black stands much better because they're already castling queenside, while that white king on d2 is completely exposed in the center and can't stay safe for long. This line isn't just a bluff, because unlike the previous example, the Albin counter gambit's fully playable. You still gotta study the positions and be ready, but this opening stands on solid ground. Now we're moving on to a trap that comes up in the Queen's Gambit declined, specifically in the Cambridge Springs defense, where the sequence goes d4, d5, c4, e6, knight to c3, knight to f6, bishop to g5, which is all standard theory in the Queen's Gambit declined, and at this point, black goes knight to d7. Let's take a closer look at what's going on here, because with bishop to g5, white pins the knight on f6, and after knight to d7, it seems like black is dropping a pawn, since white can now go c takes d5, e takes d5, and knight takes d5, taking full advantage of the pin on f6 because that knight can't recapture. And it looks like white has won a clean pawn, right? That move order is actually a tactical trap. Black responds with knight takes d5, sacrificing the queen on purpose, which might sound crazy, but is precisely what makes this trap work. Let's see what happens, because after bishop takes d8, accepting the queen, black goes bishop to b4 with check, forcing white to block with queen to d2. And then comes bishop takes d2, king takes d2, which is all completely forced with white having no choice but to give the queen back. And after king takes d2, black recaptures, king takes d8, coming out ahead by a full piece thanks to this trap. So when you look at the final position, the queens are off the board, but black ends up with the material advantage. So this move order with the knight to d7 actually has a hidden trap because it may look like black is just giving up the pawn, but just something tricky behind it. And now you might be wondering what the best move for white is in this position. And the right idea is to continue with pawn to e3, reaching a standard position after c6 that's totally playable for both sides. Alright, this one I want to show you now is also in the Ruy Lopez, so e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop to b5, knight to f6, castling, and here after castling, an alternative for black also isn't good because it's basically a move just to set a trick, and you have no idea where this is going to go the first time you see it, which is the move knight to g4, defending the pawn on e5. What's the idea of this move, this knight to g4? Well, this detail is only going to make sense once I show you the next step, because if white plays pawn to h3, attacking the knight, then black responds with h5, basically sacking the knight on g4. And if now pawn takes g4, then black takes back with the pawn, opening up the h-file, and when white brings the knight back to e1, black can go queen to h4, and there's no way to stop the mate threat on h1. Because, for example, if you play f3, then g3, and black is able to deliver mate with queen to h1. Of course, this line isn't forced at all, and what feels logical here is actually the exact opposite of what you should be doing, because knight to g4 is a mistake. You're just moving the same piece again. And here, after h3, h5, white simply doesn't have to take the sack. It doesn't have to play pawn takes g4. And if white plays a move, for example, something like pawn to d4 to open up the position and try to use the advantage in development and the black king stuck in the center, black is going to run into all kinds of problems, and very few people know how to apply this correctly in practice. Now I'm going to show you one with the queen's pawn. d4, knight f6, c4, e5. This here is the Budapest Gambit, so it's a pretty aggressive gambit against the queen's pawn. Pawn takes e5, and black goes knight to e4. And this move comes with a bunch of tricky ideas and a lot of complications that white really needs to know to handle this move, because missing this detail can cost you big time in the game. So knight to f3, a natural developing move, and pawn to d6. Black is basically just sacking the pawn here. So pawn takes d6, bishop takes d6, and at this point, white already has to be careful because what happens next can really catch you off guard. Since if white plays a move, for example, pawn to g3 to finish their to finish development, go bishop to g2 and castle, then black has a trick. And the trick here for black is knight takes f2, sacking the knight, king takes f2, and now bishop takes g3, and the queen on d1 is hanging because there's no way to defend the queen. And if you play pawn takes g3, then there's queen takes d1. So here white already has to be careful because the move pawn to g3 just isn't good. Now keep this idea in mind because it's going to make a lot more sense in a moment when I show you the correct defense, which is that you need to play pawn to e3, because if black goes knight takes f2 now, king takes f2, bishop to g3 check, you can bring the king back to e2, defending the queen on d1. So black's whole idea here is really just a trick. And here, black will still have some compensation. I don't think it's enough, but at least black is able to develop the pieces quickly, which is different from some of the traps I've already shown you here, where the whole idea is just to pull off the trick. I'm going to show you an interesting example in the Sicilian. The sequence starts e4, c5, d4, pawn takes d4, c3, pawn takes c3, knight to c3. This here is the Sicilian Smith-Morra Gambit. It's an interesting line for players who like to play gambits, and the main idea here is that white gets quick development in exchange for the sacrificed pawn. Let's see how the position develops. Black plays knight to c6, and white responds with knight to f3. The sequence continues pawn to e6, bishop to c4, queen to c7, and white castles. Then comes knight to f6, followed by queen to e2. Just look at this piece setup. This is the essence of the Smith-Morra. White is going to develop really fast and can now bring the bishop out, for example to g5. The rooks can go to d1 and c1, and all of a sudden, white has every piece in the game, and that's the compensation for the pawn sacrificed at the start. But here, black has an interesting idea, a trap to deal with the gambit. The move is knight to g4. You can see that black creates some mating ideas on h2. And now comes the critical point. If white answers this move with pawn to h3 attacking the knight, which looks like a very natural move, black can reply with knight to d4, winning the game in the sequence that follows, because knight to d4 deflects the knight on f3 and also hits the queen. If white now goes knight takes d4, then comes queen to h2, mate. So after knight to g4, white has to respond with knight to b5, attacking the queen on c7 and at the same time defending the d4 square. Now the trap I'm going to show you happens in the Italian game with the bishop on c4. When black goes pawn to d6, which is kind of a passive move, that bishop ends up stuck behind the pawn chain. So then you get knight to c3, bishop to g4, h3, bishop to h5, and this is where you reach a position that's pretty famous, featuring a classic tactical theme, which is the legal mate. It pops up right after bishop to h5, when white can sack the knight on e5, and it also sacks the queen, because after bishop takes d1, you get bishop takes f7, king to e7, and then knight to d5 as mate. This trick is actually well known, but it only works if you follow that exact wrong move order. It looks simple, but that's where the real trick is. If you play knight takes e5, black can just go queen takes h5, knight takes c4, and queen to b5 with check, grabbing the piece back and even being a pawn up. That little detail can totally flip the outcome, because even after h3, there's still bishop takes f3. White gives the bishop pair and a bit of an edge, but the position's still totally playable. What I'm going to show you now is a trap that exists in the Caro-Kann. e4, c6, d4, d5, knight to c3. This is the classical variation of the Caro-Kann defense. Pawn takes e4, knight takes, and there's a line where black goes knight to d7. And the idea for black is to bring the knight to f6, and if there's a trade on f6, recapture with the d7 knight instead of ruining the pawn structure. And here, there's a trap with queen e2, where the idea is that you can answer knight f6 with knight d6, delivering mate. This idea isn't subtle at all. It already threatens mate right away. And I'm about to show you why this works so well. I think this works better in blitz games, but the only idea behind the move is to deliver mate on d6. If black plays a move like pawn e6, for example, the queen ends up badly placed on e2, getting in the way of development on the king's side. Here, queen e2 is only there to set the trap. So if you play the Caro-Kann, keep an eye out so you don't get caught by this knight d6 delivering mate. Now the next trap starts with the queen's pawn, then comes d4, and black plays pawn to e5. This is the Englund Gambit. There are tricks behind this move, and sometimes you get caught off guard, you can get confused, and end up falling into them. So the idea of this gambit is that after pawn takes e5, black goes knight to c6, attacking the pawn to get it back. Knight to f3 defends, and black plays queen to e7 with the idea of playing knight takes e5. A very natural move here is bishop to f4, defending the pawn on e5, and this is where the trap starts. Black plays queen to b4 check, hitting both the bishop on f4 and the pawn on b2. Bishop to d2 to defend, queen takes b2, attacking the rook on a1. Here, white can play knight to c3, and the queen starts to run into trouble, but the first move that comes to mind is bishop to c3, gaining time on the queen and defending the rook on a1. But now black has some traps. It starts with bishop to b4, pinning the bishop on c3. If you play bishop takes b4, there's queen takes a1, winning the rook. So queen to d2 to defend the bishop, bishop takes c3, and if you play knight takes c3, the rook on a1 drops. And if you play queen takes c3, then comes queen to c1, mate, right? This is a dangerous opening. Don't make this mistake or you're going to regret it. Because if you just play natural, obvious moves, things can go wrong because there's this hidden trick. Now, the idea of playing queen to e7 isn't good because it just gets in the way of black's kingside development. The only reason to play this opening with knight to c6 and queen to e7 is to go for this trick, but white doesn't have to go into any of this, right? After queen to e7, just play knight to c3, a developing move, and you'll be able to get the pieces out very quickly, playing, for example, pawn to e4 now. The queen on e7 ends up only getting in the way of black's position. Now I'm going to show you an example of a position that comes out of the French defense. So e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, the advanced variation, pawn to c5, c3, knight to c6, knight to f3, queen to b6, and here white can go bishop to d3. Here everything is very natural. In the French, black develops the pieces with knight to c6 and queen to b6 to pressure the center and attack the pawn on d4. There's a gambit line where white plays bishop to d3 with the idea of sacrificing the pawn on d4. And there's a trap in this position. If black plays pawn takes d4, pawn recaptures on d4, knight takes d4, accepting the pawn, white can go knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and then bishop to b5 check comes in, giving a discovered attack and winning the queen. There are already 2 videos here on the channel where I break down this trap, both when you're playing black and when you're playing white, with interesting ideas for both sides. I'll leave them in the card now. And this is one more trap you need to keep an eye on if you play the French. If you're playing against the French, it's also possible to go for this gambit. Black should go pawn takes, and bishop to d7, being able to take the pawn on d4 without running into the discovered attack theme. It's a playable line, but you still need to be careful with your opponent's traps. I'm going to show you a very well-known trap in the Ruy Lopez. After bishop to b5, pawn to a6, bishop to a4, d6, this is the Steinitz variation. Not many people talk about this, but it's fundamental. I'm going to show you a classic trick called the Noah's Ark Trap, and it works like this. White plays d4, a very natural move, pawn to b5, attacking the bishop, bishop to b3, and now black's idea to set the trap starts, which goes like this. Knight takes d4, knight recaptures on d4, pawn takes d4, and if white goes queen takes d4, black can play pawn to c5. This is the Noah's Ark Trap. Black goes pawn to c5 and pawn to c4, and the bishop has no squares. And even if white plays queen to d5, attacking f7 and the rook on a8, black can answer with bishop to e6, queen to c6 check, bishop to d7, queen to d5, and now pawn to c4. Black ends up winning the white bishop on b3. So what should white do in this position? White can castle or play pawn to c3, sacrificing a pawn. After pawn takes c3, knight takes c3, white gets a lot of compensation for the pawn because the pieces are very well developed. You just can't go queen takes d4 right away or you lose the bishop on b3. Not every trap is worth using, and a lot of the time these moves are played just hoping your opponent falls for the trick. But beyond that, they don't really make sense because they break basic opening principles and can leave your position almost lost. But here's the point. If you stop here, you're going to miss what really punishes players who push the king's pawn thinking they're safe, with a gambit that reveals 10 traps in a single game, one after another, every move loaded with threats. Click the video that's showing up on the screen right now and discover how to punish the king's pawn with precision, create initiative from the second move, and turn every move into an ambush. So click now, because if you stop here, you already know how this story ends. And if you watched all the way through and like the way I explain things, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.